All right, chapter 5. Here we go. Riding in open country about 10 miles south of Washington, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold would soon reach their own safe house. They did not expect any trouble along the road. They did not meet any soldiers as they rode toward Surratt's tavern. If they did, there was no danger because they were riding ahead of the news of the assassination. At this moment, Booth could safely ride past an entire regiment of Union cavalry. Not a soul in Maryland knew yet that Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Within a few minutes of the assassination, the news began spreading, first by word of mouth from Ford's, then by messenger. It traveled no faster than a man could run on foot or ride on horseback. Between 10:30 and 11 p.m., more than 1,500 people spilled out from the theater onto the streets. They fanned out in all directions like an unpaid army of newsboys, shouting, "Extra!" Block by block, they spread the news. Men ran or galloped to the White House, the War Department, the homes of cabinet officers. They rushed home and wakened family members and knocked on neighbors' doors and roused children from their beds, spreading the news. Washingtonians were used to getting important news this way. Tonight, like an inferno, burning outward in all directions from a single ignition point, the news that Lincoln had been shot spread from Ford's in an ever-widening circle. A few blocks from Ford's, word of another apparent assassination spread from the Seward mansion and into the streets. Neighbors, soldiers, and State Department employees, and even some reporters tried to enter the Seward house. Messengers fanned out in all directions, shouting about the Seward assassination, just as the news spread from Ford's to the president's assassination. It was only a matter of time before the two groups bringing word of separate attacks met in the streets. The same words were exchanged countless times in the night. "No, I tell you it was Lincoln who was assassinated. Impossible, it was Seward. I just came from his house. And I just came from Ford's. It was Lincoln. It was Seward." Then the terrible truth emerged. It was both. Though unknown at the time, Seward still lived. Both men were attacked. The false information that Seward had been killed would continue to be spread through word of mouth. At 13th and K Streets, someone rang the bell at the home of the Secretary of War, Edward M. Stanton. A brilliant man with a long record of public service, the president placed his capable hands in the most demanding tasks of the war: raising, training, equipping, and sending into the Army of the Union. Creating the Army was the largest organizational achievement in American history up to that time. Stanton weeded out unfit and incompetent officers, battled dishonest government contractors who sold the Army low-quality uniforms, rotting equipment, and defective weapons, and endured an epidemic of officers who would not fight. If any man sat at Lincoln's right hand during the war, it was Edwin Stanton. He is important. Stanton had been among those to turn down the president's invitation to join him and Mary at Ford's Theater tonight. Instead, he left his office at the War Department and went home to dinner with his wife. Around 8 p.m., not long after the curtain rose at Ford's, Stanton left his house to visit his friend William H. Seward at his sickbed. Ever since the carriage accident Seward had suffered, Stanton had been a faithful visitor. He returned home about an hour later. After he bid some visiting Army officers good night, he closed his front door and locked it. It was 10 p.m. He walked upstairs and began undressing for bed. Not long after, the doorbell rang. His wife, still downstairs, unlocked and opened the door. If she had known about the murderous events of the evening, she most likely would not have opened the door. When she heard the, as it turned out incorrect, news from the messenger, she shouted, "Mr. Seward is murdered." Her cry reached her husband upstairs, who did not believe what he heard. "Humbug," he shouted down. "I left him only an hour ago." Stanton, still doubting, came downstairs. He found the messenger and several other agitated men. Alarmed by their manner and their story, he decided to ride over to the Seward home to investigate the murder of Seward's death personally. The ride to Seward House took only a few minutes, and the first sign was not good. People filled the streets and crowded around Seward's front door. An hour ago, when Stanton left the Seward home, the street was deserted. Stanton arrived moments after the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, reached Seward's house. A Navy Department messenger shouted unwelcome and again inaccurate news. President Lincoln had been shot, and Secretary Seward and his son Frederick had been assassinated. "Where," asked Welles, "was the president shot?" "At Ford's Theater," the messenger replied, adding that the Sewards had been attacked at home. "Damn the rebels," Welles cursed. This was their work. He walked with the messenger to Seward's house. Stanton, just behind Wells, charged up the stairs to Seward's bedroom. It was true. A scene of mayhem replaced the calm that Stanton had seen a little more than an hour before. The bed had saturated with blood. Several doctors hovering over the body of Secretary of State, working to save his life. Fanny Seward was wandering like a pale ghost, her dress dripping in blood. That was not all. Augustus Seward had been stabbed, and his brother Frederick was unconscious from a crushed skull. Brave Sergeant Robinson had endured multiple stab wounds. Recovering from their initial shock, Stanton and Wells realized that there was nothing they could do for the victims. It was in the hands of the doctors and God. They had turned their thoughts to the president and the rest of the cabinet. Stanton gave orders to rush military guards to the home of every member of the cabinet and to Vice President Johnson's hotel. Without guards or army escort, despite the danger that still might lurk in Washington, Stanton and Wells rode in a carriage to Ford's Theater. As the carriage clipped along, it passed men and women running crazily in all directions. The closer they got to Ford's, the thicker the crowds became. As the carriage turned down F Street, it approached a roaring, angry mob of thousands of people swarming the street in front of Ford's. On 10th Street, Dr. Leal ordered Lincoln's bearers to head straight for the man with a candle standing at the top of the stairs in the Peterson house. The soldiers carried the president up the curved staircase. In this elevated position, the near lifeless body of Abraham Lincoln became visible to the entire crowd gathered below. In awe, the people watched as their president disappeared into the boarding house. Except for a handful of doctors, government officials, and family friends who could enter the Peterson house, that glimpse of the president ascending the stairs was the last time Americans saw Abraham Lincoln alive. Almost 13 miles out of Washington, Booth and Herold approached their destination, Surrattsville, Maryland. The town was small, little more than a crossroad outpost, named after the family that owned the tavern there. Before they could continue in their escape south, the fugitives had business at the tavern. They would pick up the shooting irons. Mary Surratt had ordered Mr. Lloyd to get ready that afternoon. Surratt's place was hard to spot at night. The plain two-story structure was unpainted, and the dull wood boards reflected no moonlight. The tavern had served 3 functions: saloon, inn, and post office. In 1864, Mary Surratt, under a cloud of suspicion over her husband's loyalty to the Union, had moved her family to Washington, D.C., to her Washington, D.C. boarding house and rented the tavern to John Lloyd. The tavern operated as a typical 19th century roadside establishment. It was divided into private and public spaces. Paying customers entered not through the front door, but through a side door that led directly into the bar and post office. The room smelled like wax, candles, oil lamps, tobacco, burning stove wood, whiskey, dirty clothes, and leather boots. That's kind of an interesting description. Drink and meals were posted on a wall or chalked on a board. Nighttime callers were not unusual. Booth and Herold rode their horses to the side entrance. The night was still. Inside the tavern was quiet and dark. They had to make this quick. Herold dismounted and walked to the door while Booth remained in the saddle. They had no time to waste, and it would hurt Booth too much to dismount and put weight on his foot. Herold's pounding fist finally roused the innkeeper. John Lloyd climbed out of the bed and went downstairs and opened the side door. He recognized David Herold, a friend of John Surratt. Herold, impatient, hissed at him. "Lloyd, for God's sake, make haste and get those things." Herold did not have to be more specific. Lloyd knew what they wanted. After Mary Surratt's afternoon visit, he took the shooting irons from their hiding place so they would be ready for the callers. Lloyd returned in a moment, bearing the small package wrapped in twine, the binoculars, and a loaded Spencer repeating carbine. Booth would further arm himself when he picked up pistols at his next stop. As Herold and Booth prepared to ride away, Booth could not resist the temptation to brag. The impulsive actor had to tell someone of his achievement or he would burst. He told Lloyd, "I'm pretty certain we have assassinated the president and Secretary Seward." Lloyd watched the pair ride off into the night, not understanding exactly what Booth meant. He went back to bed. Booth and Herold had spent less than 5 minutes in Surrattsville. One thing to note, remember he gave the binoculars to Mary Seward, who took them to John Lloyd, who gave them back to him hours later, and they're never mentioned again. Why did he need binoculars? I don't know. They continued to the southeast for an unplanned but unnecessary detour. Booth's leg was throbbing painfully. He needed a doctor, and he knew just where to find one. 4 hours' ride away. At the Peterson house, Abraham Lincoln would soon have more doctors than he could ever want, but little use for any of them. Abraham Lincoln's body was carried into the dim hall that led to the rear of the boarding house. As bearers shuffled along through the tight passageway, they passed the parlors and stepped into the back room. The boarder who rented the room was out for the evening, celebrating the end of the war. Leal examined the small room with a bed, its headboard wedged in the corner. He glanced around the room. The place would have to do. Chasing after the president, Mary Todd Lincoln, followed by Clara Harris and Major Rathburn, with Laura Keene trailing close behind, burst into the boarding house. Wringing her hands, Mary Todd Lincoln pleaded, "Where is my husband? Where is my husband?" No one in particular. In the back bedroom, only one person mattered now. Someone tore back the bedding. Someone else turned up the valve of the gas jet coming out of the hall. In an instant, the hissing, burning gas vapor lit the grotesque scene. The others laid the unconscious body across the mattress. Mary Todd Lincoln burst into the room, and the bright gaslight confirmed to her that this was not a nightmare she had hoped it was. This was real. The air in the room was warmed and moist. With too many people in it competing for oxygen from the air, Leal ordered the windows open and everyone but the doctors to leave the room. Mrs. Lincoln hovered over her husband. Leal gently encouraged her to leave the room and wait in the front parlor. Alone with their patient, the doctors worked quickly to remove the president's clothes. Strangers slipped into the Peterson house before the guards could be posted at the door. People invading the house inched their way down the hall closer to Lincoln. If someone did not take command of the situation soon, the house would be in chaos. Stanton's carriage came to a stop, unable to get through the crowd. If they could not drive through, they would walk. On foot in the dark, in the midst of thousands of people, anything could happen that night. Indeed, it already had, but now Stanton and Wells exited the carriage, headed into the mob, and vanished from sight. The doctors examined Lincoln's body for knife or gun wounds, but found nothing other than the bullet hole in his head. The president's feet and legs were already getting cold. The eyelids were filled with blood that they looked bruised, and someone had punched the president in the face. All signs were consistent with a catastrophic injury of the brain. The surgeons covered Lincoln's body with sheets and blankets. His breathing was regular but heavy, interrupted with an occasional sigh. They laid a clean white napkin over the bloodstains on the pillow. They placed a small chair at the head of the bed near Lincoln's face. Now the president was ready for Mary to see him again. Leal sent an officer to fetch her. She rushed into the room, sat beside her husband. "Love, live, but for one moment to speak to me once, to speak to our children." Lincoln was deaf to her pleas. The president's medical condition stable for the moment, Dr. Leal sent messengers to fetch Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son, Surgeon General Joseph K. Barnes, Lincoln's family physician, another physician, and the president's pastor, the Reverend Dr. Phineas T. Gurley. Leal sent a hospital steward in search of a special piece of medical equipment, a Nealaton probe. There was work to do inside Lincoln's brain. Ignoring the danger of the surging crowd, Stanton pushed through, up the stairs, into the back bedroom of the Peterson house. The sight of the president shocked him. He did not need doctors to tell him what would happen. Abraham Lincoln was going to die, and there was nothing the doctors could do about it. But he could do something for the president. He could protect and defend the country. Stanton took charge, making the back parlor of the Peterson house his field office. He would not return to the War Department yet, but would remain here. Stanton believed that the Lincoln and Seward assassinations had exposed a Confederate plot to kill the leaders of the national government in an attempt to reverse the results of the Civil War. Stanton and his lieutenants assumed that all the cabinet heads had been marked for death that night, and a rebel army would be advancing on Washington at any moment. Stanton wanted his commanding general, Ulysses S. Grant, back in Washington. He sent a telegram to order Grant back to Washington at once. It was the first telegram issued from the temporary War Department headquarters at the Peterson house. Stanton ordered troops to turn out into the streets, and guards to be doubled, military forts to be alert, guns manned, and special guards to be posted around the old Capitol prison. "Clear away the mob from the street in front of the house," Stanton ordered. Soldiers tried to push back from the crowd around the foot of the staircase. The immediate area secured, Stanton turned to his second mission, launching the investigation into the crimes that had occurred at Ford's and at the Seward house. He was determined to catch the criminals. He made it clear he was in charge. Later, when Vice President Johnson arrived at the deathbed, he remained in the background and chose not to take charge. In the days to follow, newly sworn-in President Johnson left it to Stanton to bring Lincoln's killer and his accomplices to justice. Stanton had witnesses from Ford's Theater brought before him. One witness after another swore it was Booth, John Wilkes Booth, who shot the president. Stanton's operators could wire news and orders all over the country, and soon telegraph lines across the nation were announcing the news. The president had been assassinated and the Secretary of State attacked. Messages were telegraphed to Baltimore, New York, and beyond. Search the trains, guard the bridges. Orders were sent to commanders in the field of Virginia, chasing down leads based on early but false information. Stanton received from the tipsters. In need of help at 1:10 a.m. on April 15th, Stanton sent a request to the chief of police in New York City, asking him to send his best detectives to assist in the investigation of the assassinations. He continued to expand the search, activating manhunters in Delaware and Pennsylvania. Booth was identified to detectives as the assassin. Orders were sent to cover possible water escape routes. Cavalry rode to the Occoquan River to intercept anyone who attempted to cross. Fishermen along the river were notified to keep watch for Booth. The hunt had begun in earnest. Back in Washington, Army Major General Halleck had made plans to imprison the assassins when they were caught. If Booth was captured, the Army would have to protect him and from Lincoln's avengers, rampaging mobs of vigilantes who might storm the old prison if they discovered Booth jailed there. It was too risky to imprison Booth anywhere on land. Halleck issued an order. If the assassins were caught, they put them in double irons and take them to the commander of the Washington Navy Yard, who will confine them to a monitor warship anchored there. The river would protect Booth from the angry citizens of Washington. All they had to do was catch John Wilkes Booth, Lewis Powell, John Surratt, David Harold, and George Atzerodt. The doctors, this is another gross part. The doctors probed Lincoln's bullet wound with their bare, dirty fingers, sticking their pinkies inside Lincoln's brain. They used the Neapolitan probe to find the bullet for possible removal, as if that would have helped Lincoln. Eventually, the physicians gave up their tinkering and simply monitored Lincoln's heartbeat, temperature, and breathing. While Lincoln still lived, the manhunt was already underway. At Ford's Theater, the Derringer pistol, the murder weapon, was recovered from the floor of the president's box. Soldiers and detectives rushed to Booth's room at the National Hotel. Of course, Booth was gone, but they searched his trunk and discovered an incredible mysterious letter to Booth, signed only Sam, that described a large conspiracy against the Union government. Several blocks from the National Hotel, just a few hours after the assassination, a group of detectives showed up at Mary Surratt's boarding house. In the chaos in the streets outside Ford's Theater, one or more sources reported that John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt were close friends and that Mrs. Surratt's boarding house was just a few blocks away. A boarder and a school friend of John Surratt, Louis Weichman, was the first to appear at the door to respond to the patrol's arrival. The detectives announced their mission. They were there to search the house for John Wilkes Booth and John Surratt. Weichman knocked on Mrs. Surratt's bedroom door, telling her that detectives had come to search the house. She instructed Weichman to let them in. Weichman seemed not to know why the house was being searched. One detective revealed the shocking and half-false information that the occupants of Surratt's boarding house. John Wilkes Booth had shot the president, and John Surratt has assassinated the Secretary of State. Weichman told detectives John Surratt was not at home, but in Canada, and offered to help them with their investigation. Mary Surratt claimed not to know where her son was. The detectives searched the house, then left, leaving Weichman, Mary, and her daughter Anna behind. Throughout the night and into the morning, Mary Todd Lincoln made regular visits to her husband's bedside. At one point she wailed, "Oh, that my little Tatty might see his father before he died," then fainted, falling to the floor. Stanton, startled by her cry and fearing that the president had died, rushed into the room and called out loudly, "Take that woman out and do not let her in here again." She did not deserve that cruelty, and it did not matter. Stanton was obeyed. After riding half the night in the deserted road south from Surrattsville, Booth and David Harold nearly neared their destination, an isolated farmhouse a few miles north of a village called Bryantown. A city-dwelling night rider unfamiliar with a remote area might have missed the turnoff in the dark, but Booth rode confidently ahead. He had been here before. There appeared a handsome 2-story house in the distance. Booth recognized their sanctuary at once. They could rest here. They would not be rushed, as they were at Surratt's Tavern, which was much too close to Washington and possible pursuers. Here, farther south and in the darkness of this remote countryside, they could rest, eat, and sleep, and Booth could get medical care for his injured leg, which he was sure was broken. He needed to renew his strength after being awake for almost 24 hours. He was dog-tired, and his weary body ached from 5 bumpy hours on horseback. The spring night air was still and eerily silent. Booth and Harold approached the farmhouse. No barking dogs warned of their arrival, and the slow pace of their horse hoofs failed to awaken the 6 people sleeping in the house. Harold dismounted and walked to the house while Booth remained in his saddle. The assassin was alert for signs and sounds of danger. No lamplight shone through the window in the front yard. David would have to wake the people inside. He knocked on the door and waited for signs of life within the house. The loud rapping awoke the farmer, who was alarmed at being awakened in the middle of the night. The farmer rose from his bed, walked to the front door, and called, "Who's there?" to the person on the other side. "2 strangers," replied David Harold, "on their way to Washington. One of their horses had fallen," he claimed, throwing the rider and breaking his leg. Hesitating, the farmer peered through a window, then unlocked the door. In his front yard, he saw 2 men, about 20 feet away, standing under a cedar tree. He approached them. Booth relaxed at the sight of a familiar face. The farmer helped Booth dismount, offering support when the fugitive's body weight bore down on his injured leg. Booth grimaced in pain when his feet touched the ground. He staggered into the arms of Dr. Samuel A. Mudd. He's important. Their faces only inches apart, Mudd helped Booth limp up the steps into his home. Harold tended the horses, then followed Booth and Dr. Mudd inside the farmhouse. Harold was a stranger to Mudd. The doctor had never laid eyes on him before, but Booth was not. There you go. Samuel Mudd. The chain of events led John Wilkes Booth to Mudd's farm at pre-dawn hours on April 15, 1865, began 6 months earlier in Montreal, Canada. By late 1864, Booth had hatched a risky plan to kidnap President Lincoln. He attempted to recruit accomplices in New York City, a place where there were many Lincoln haters and Confederate sympathizers. Booth knew the city well, of course. He had acted there many times. North of New York, Canada was a major base of operations for the Confederate Secret Service. In Montreal, nests of rebel agents with plans and money were busy hatching anti-Union conspiracies. Booth sought contacts there. He and his little band of conspirators would snatch Lincoln and transport him out of Washington south to Richmond. He needed no less than a rebel version of the Underground Railroad that transported runaway slaves north to freedom. Booth's railroad, however, would run in reverse. He would take the tyrant Lincoln, who had freed the slaves, south to the Confederate capital of Richmond. He would trade Lincoln for Confederate prisoners of war or attempt to use his captive as leverage to give the South an advantage in peace negotiations. To pull off his plan, he needed loyal Confederate agents and safe houses located at points along the route. One operative he met in Canada gave Booth letters of introduction, vouching for the actor's devotion to the Confederacy and requesting aid for him. One of the letters was addressed to Samuel A. Mudd. Mudd, 32 years old, was a doctor living on a farm with his wife and family. He was anti-Union, anti-Black, and the owner of up to 11 slaves before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had freed them. By November 9th of 1864, Booth had visited Bryantown Tavern in southern Maryland, a combination saloon, inn, and post office not unlike Surratt's Tavern. It was known among Confederate sympathizers as a reliable safe house and place to exchange information. I don't know why the post office was always attached to the saloon. Apparently that was a time thing. A few days later at church, Booth was introduced to Dr. Mudd. In Maryland, a month later, Booth again encountered Mudd at church. Booth invented a cover story. He claimed to be looking for real estate to buy and a horse to buy. Booth needed horses for the kidnapping gang he hoped to put together. Mudd was happy to help. After church, Booth rode home with the doctor and spent the night at his farm. Mudd introduced Booth to a neighbor who sold Booth a peculiar one-eyed horse. Dr. Mudd had been helpful to Booth in Maryland, but the actor also needed the doctor's help, an introduction in Washington. Mudd went to Washington to introduce Booth to a Confederate courier named John Harrison Surratt. Surratt operated out of his mother's boarding house on H Street, from her county tavern to Surrattsville. Booth would require the type of help Surratt could provide, along his escape route. So do you see how this like web has weaved? Like Booth is trying to get all these people connected. He gets connected to Mudd. Mudd gets him this one-eyed horse, then gets him connected to Surratt, and Mary Surratt is the one that gets his stuff to the tavern. Like it's all one big complicated interconnection. On the way to the H Street boarding house, Booth and Mudd encountered John Surratt on the street. An introduction took place. Booth invited everyone, Mudd, Surratt, and Louis Weichman, a friend of Surratt's and a boarder at the H Street house, back to his room at the National Hotel for drinks and private conversation. Booth recruited Surratt into the conspiracy to kidnap the president and soon became a frequent visitor to the boarding house, where he befriended Surratt's widowed mother and younger sister Anna. His work done, Mudd returned just before Christmas 1864 to the farm and waited for further word from Booth about the kidnapping. No word ever came. Lincoln's second inauguration came and went in March. Richmond fell on April 3rd. Lee surrendered on April 9th. But Mudd saw no more of Booth. Booth had sent liquor and supplies to Mudd's farm for hiding until the day for Booth and the kidnapped victim to flee the city, but it never did. Given the disastrous events of 1865, Mudd assumed that the Union victory had changed the actors' plans and the scheme to kidnap the president had been abandoned. Now, 4 months later, Booth was here at the farm again, though the doctor, standing in the darkness of his front yard, did not know yet. Once inside, Booth sat on the sofa in the front parlor, then reclined. Mudd lit an oil lamp and dialed up the flame to permit a proper examination of his new patient. Their eyes locked in recognition. In an instant, the doctor knew the identity of the man who was lying in front of him. How could he fail to recognize the actor's familiar thick black hair, pale complexion, trademark mustache, and striking good looks? The first step in the examination process would be to pry the thigh-high cavalry boot off Booth's left leg. Mudd stood on one end of the sofa and took a firm grip of the heel and sole and tugged. Booth's jaw clamped tight in pain. The boot would not budge. The injury to Booth's leg had caused the tissue to swell up and create a seal that could not be broken without inflicting agony upon the patient and possibly worsening the injury. Mudd made a cut on the boot near the ankle, careful not to cut too deeply to open Booth's soft flesh. Mudd seized the boot firmly and pulled slowly. This time it slipped off. He dropped the boot to the floor, removed Booth's socks, and pushed his pant leg up his calf and began the examination. The diagnosis was simple, a broken fibula. Mudd informed Booth that he had a broken bone about 2 inches above the ankle joint. The doctor did not regard it as a particularly dangerous or painful, reassuring Booth that he could treat the injury. He improvised a splint for Booth. It was now about 5 a.m. Booth knew he should press on south. He knew he was still traveling ahead of the news of the assassination, which Mudd was not yet aware of. He knew that the news would spread and overtake him, making the daylight hours unsafe for traveling. Booth weighed the risk of capture against a desire for food and rest. No one in the world knew he had gone to Mudd's tonight. He had not known he would go there himself until after he shot Lincoln and injured his leg. Better to hide out and chance discovery than be caught in the open country at sunrise. He and Harold would spend what few hours remaining of this night at the farm, rest there all day, and then ride south at nightfall. Mudd invited the pair to rest in his house for the night. He offered them a room upstairs and bade them good night. Unknown to Mudd, he had just extended his hospitality to Lincoln's assassin and his accomplice. Their secret was still safe from Mudd and his family, and their location a mystery to the manhunters. Harold and Booth collapsed into their beds as Booth drifted off to sleep. He did not know whether his master plan had succeeded or failed. George Azeroth and George Azeroth and Lewis Powell carried out their missions to murder the vice president and Secretary Stewart? And what of the president? Had Booth killed Abraham Lincoln, or did the tyrant still live? Booth did not know. He would be condemned in the morning papers as the most wanted man in America. While Booth and Harold slept in the Mudd farmhouse, the 1st Cavalry Patrol rode south from Washington, headed for Maryland. Soon, this group from the 13th New York Cavalry, commanded by Lieutenant David Dana, would ride close to Mudd Farm. Booth had about 7 hours.